Hello, welcome to EDFG5810, and this week we're looking at ethics and what you need to know to meet with the seal of approval, which is very cute, perhaps a bit cheesy, but nevertheless very cute, in respect to ethical considerations for your projects. We're also going to talk about sampling because I think that fits quite nicely hand in hand as you're considering your participants. So learning intention this week is for you to develop a clear understanding of the ethical considerations that relate to your proposed research and to develop an understanding of research ethics and processes for evaluating ethics. In fact, one of the things you're going to do is check out or fill out a checklist. That's one of your success criteria for your research. You're also going to provide some considered responses to a range of ethical dilemmas as part of a quiz this week. In respect to sampling, you are supposed to understand the research principles in relation to sampling as a methodological consideration, and that's something that you will actually demonstrate in your next assignment. So, looking then at a definition of ethics in respect to practitioner research, which is what we're dealing with, ethics isn't just a series of boxes that we tick, even though we might think so when we look at those checklists. It is demanded by University Human Research Ethics Committee, which is what that HEREC stands for, but it also sits within a wider scope in respect to demands really from research ethics organisations on a national scale. So these documents are actually not unique for a particular university. They're pretty much the same all over Australia. And having looked at as you read through chapter 6, you would have seen that there are actually a lot of similarities as well with the UK. So these are deeply embedded considerations in respect to working in the field in a substantive and an engaged way, and it's there for a reason. It's to assure that sloppy or poorly devised or unbalanced or inadequately thought out research is prevented, because that could potentially damage people, and it would certainly be a waste of time if nothing else. So it's to stop those things. It's actually to prompt all the people, just like yourself, who are investigating, to consider all these different, the myriad of considerations that apply. And when we look at ethics forms, they're actually filled out by all researchers across all disciplines. So it's not just people who are in their final year of uni or who are conducting a PhD or something like that, which means that a lot of the questions are quite broad. And even when you look at the minimal risk type of form that you're going to fill out, you will find that a lot of those questions, in fact all of those questions, should be answered in a way that they don't apply, but they're there as a safety net, if you like. Also, ethical procedures are really framed by the whole idea of confidentiality, permission and informed consent, so that people know what they're agreeing to and they don't feel under pressure to participate. They know that it's completely up to them and they can choose to stop participating at any time. And as a researcher, all you can do is say, oh, well, thank you for your time, I completely respect that. So ethics ensures that no harm is done to people through their inclusion in research. When we talk about minimal risk can really be defined in this context as the foreseeable risks, or the likelihood of participants, the greatest risk that they could possibly see or be exposed to is one of discomfort, nothing else. And this sort of minimal risk research involves methodologies like questionnaires, surveys, whether they are anonymous or otherwise. That could be online surveys as well, about non-sensitive topics, and that's really important. Discrete observations that you conduct as part of your practice as a teacher, that would be fine. But if it's anything that's out of the normal scope of what teachers do, then that wouldn't actually fit under these requirements and restrictions. Before we kick off any further, I want you to take a moment to think about what do we actually mean by being ethically responsible, and why do we need to be ethically responsible? I've kind of touched on that already, but nevertheless, I want you to think about it. Just take a moment, pause this and jot down some thinking, some thoughts. Essentially, there are three principles that guide all these ethical forms that you fill out, whether you're going for a full ethical review or not. You won't be for this subject or for Researcher B. First of all, it's the benefit of it, maximising good outcomes and minimising any unnecessary risk or harm or even discomfort for that matter. Treating the participants with respect and courtesy and really respecting privacy, which is essential. Justice is another one, to make sure that reasonable, non-exploitative and carefully considered procedures guide the research to, again, make sure that it's both beneficial and that we're treating our participants with respect. In this week's reading, in the Wilson text, you have a description of someone called Mary who's looking at improving thinking skills with their students. I'm not going to read this out to you. I want you to keep this in mind, though. This scenario will actually be the scenario that you relate to some of the considerations on the forum, and you're going to get the task very shortly. In fact, now. Think of ethical principles in respect to what I just had on the slide before, Mary's scenario there. The idea of treating people with respect, being beneficial and minimizing harm, etc. Think of those three ethical principles and think, oh, I did this again. Sorry, just scratch that because your task is actually coming up now. Okay, for the scenario with Mary, what I want you to do is think of the three phases of Mary's project. So pre-planning, as it's being conducted, and after it's being conducted while Mary's writing up her research findings. And I want you to think about two ways that she would demonstrate that she would treat her participants in an ethical manner, and also two examples which could be considered as Mary treating her participants in an unethical manner, and share those thoughts on the forum. So for pre-planning or the preparation stages while she's conducting the project, which includes then the pre-test and the post-test in that scenario, and then as she writes up, what are two things that would be good and ethical, and what are two things that would not be a good idea? Share that on the forum. In respect to the requirements that apply to you guys, one of the things, as I said, you will be doing today is to complete a risk assessment of your research. And in fact, let me just show you. In this week's, let's go to, just bear with me for one moment. In this week's forum, this looks slightly different because I'm your lecturer, so that is somewhat different from the way it's going to look for you guys. Sorry, let me just scroll down. Sorry about this. It's one I should have prepared earlier. Here, you've got a book with ethics forms. And what I want you to do in that, the very first one, the Herrick checklist, if you click on that link, that's actually something that you need to complete. I want you to do it preferably this week while it's all fresh in your mind. In fact, all these forms, at least the ones that are relevant for you, should be, so if you're not proposing to conduct surveys, for example, you'd skip that one with plain language statement about surveys and sample questions. But if you're thinking of interviewing mentor teachers as part of your project, for example, then you would have the interview questions. These forms are part of a bulk ethics approval for Fed Uni, which Peter Sellings, who's a lecturer at Mount Helen, prepared. He was teaching this course previously, or at Mount Helen, I should say. So a lot of these things are actually in existence for you guys, but you will need to complete the relevant forms for your project, and put them in as an appendix with your second assignment. Also, this is really important for those of you who are doing Project B, because when that starts, the expectation is that all these forms are completed. So that the amendment can just be changed. So there is actually a bulk ethics application that's already got a provisional approval from the Ethics Committee at FedUni for students undertaking this course and for Project B. So each of you will need to fill out a bulk amendment form, which is in that book I just showed you on Moodle. You will need to give a name for the project, your methodology, which is what you're doing as part of your proposal anyway, just a brief methodology that you fill in that bulk amendment form, with a couple of references, and a brief assessment risk, which is that first form in the book that I just showed you. You will need to attach that with your second assessment task, your assignment, as an appendix. It doesn't go towards the word count. Also, you should attach surveys, questionnaires, which is why those sample questionnaires and interview questions are really helpful. And that again becomes an appendix that you would attach, because you would put that in with your bulk. Certainly if you're taking B, that will be forms that you will fill in as part of that bulk amendment and that bulk grant that's already been given for approval. Okay, when we're looking at the Human Ethics Committee, and in fact if you go on this particular slide, you can follow the link straight to that form. The Human Research Ethics Committee here at FedUni, and this is actually the same requirements as at other universities, note that some projects are of minimal risk, and for those purposes they've got something called an expedited review, which is what Peter has applied for, and that's where that bulk application comes from. However, it is important to keep in mind that for such an approval, and for you to be covered by this sort of approval, we cannot use intrusive techniques, which means that we can only use things like observation. We can of a classroom, for example. You can use interviews with grown-ups, so with teachers, and you can use questionnaires, and that could actually be like a worksheet for students. That's fine, that's not an intrusive technique, but anything like actually interviewing a student formally would, under these circumstances, be called an intrusive technique. There would also be a discomfort consideration there. So if there's any risk of discomfort, particularly because we're talking about children in a school setting, it's a big consideration. Vulnerable individuals, so minors, which is obviously something that we're dealing with as teachers, or kids with special needs, where if they're intellectually or mentally impaired, highly dependent on medical care, that goes for grown-ups as well. All those are considerations that are really taken very, very seriously by ethics committees, which is why any project dealing with that would not fall under this kind of bulk approval or an expedited approval, which is a consideration. Also important to keep in mind that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals are considered, if you like, a vulnerable group. So therefore, any project that is dealing particularly with Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander individuals would not fall under this. So that means that you cannot necessarily, or you can't engage with groups that would be fit under that category. However, if you're looking at a school setting, which is what you're doing, and you want to speak to a Koori coordinator, that would be fine, because it still fits within the normal work of a school, of a teacher, I should say. But it's something to keep in mind, and you would actually put, in respect to that very question, I would put that as a special consideration, just to explain where you're coming from. Clinical tests, etc. doesn't apply to us, we don't have to worry about that, but there's a whole lot of things there to keep in mind. So as you fill in, if you click on that link, and you got the link in the book as well on Moodle, you get straight to the list, and you will find that you're basically clicking no all the time, but nevertheless it's something that you need to fill in and put in together with your assignment. So keep it in mind, it doesn't take very long. I'm going to give you, this is called a small group task, because that's a bit of a leftover from the face-to-face delivery. the online cohort has actually got these 7 dilemmas as a quiz on Moodle. So I want you to do this. I've deliberately chosen to do it as a quiz because I want you to reflect individually. I don't want those answers to be necessarily available because there might be lots of things that you haven't thought of, or there might be things that you just don't want to share because you're not sure whether or not this is right or wrong. I will talk about your responses because I will be able to see your responses next week, but I deliberately chose not to do it as an online thing. You can still, if you want to put a posting about your reflection, you're more than welcome to do that on this week's forum. Anyway, so do that. Now we're going to shift the focus slightly and look at sampling in action research or practitioner research. And we're going to look at sampling both from a qualitative perspective or kind of an inductive emerging paradigm or approach, and also from a quantitative or deductive approach. So first of all, have a think about, we're talking about often purposive sampling and probability sampling. And in qualitative research, we're talking about purposive sampling because we purposefully select particular participants, whereas a probability sampling model fits in with the idea of random sampling, that everyone has got the same likelihood of being chosen, with the idea of trying to produce research findings that actually apply to a general public. And that's the idea of the deductive versus the site-specific. So I've kind of answered that question already, but it was there as a bit of a prompt for you. When we're looking at practitioner research or action research, we're often seeking to represent, actually we can have a number of different aims, and this is something that we articulate when you explain your sampling considerations in your methodology section of your proposal, particularly in your next proposal, which is really enhancing that methodology section. You might deliberately want to find really representative of, you might want to find really diverse perspectives from the group, in which case you would deliberately pick those kind of people and interview, for example, teachers who have very different views about whatever it is that you're looking at. Often it's also, particularly in action research, which has got a really democratic principle, and it's something that we often do as a group. It could be, a whole team of teachers doing an action research project, or a school working on an action research, whereas you're looking at practitioner research that informs your practice first and foremost. So often, particularly when we're doing it in a group, we're looking at having participants, sampling participants that have a significant impact in a group, because we're looking at change. But it means also that you're deliberately picking participants that have impact, that can answer your research question. Sometimes we sample people who have typical experiences, so we don't want that diverse perspective. We want the 2.4 kids, if you like. We want the really typical experience and the perspective to represent Joe Blogs, if you like. All these are considerations that you need to decide on, how you position yourself and what applies for you. So it's a matter of actually thinking about what's your research question, what's your aim. And then as you're justifying your sampling, you're explaining why this is a consideration, how this helps you answer your question. Another thing that sometimes is done deliberately is to include participants who have particularly unusual or significant experiences. So that's completely different from the typical. Again, depends on your question, depends on your aim. Stringer is an action research person that's written about that. Purposive sampling, which is what we're using in qualitative research and often in practitioner research, is very strategic in nature, because we do deliberately pick people who are relevant to the research question. Remember, we're looking at something that's specific to a particular context. We're not looking at generalizing findings, we're looking at really getting a nuanced and a complex understanding of your particular context, your school that you're at, or whatever your thing is that you're looking at. So therefore, we're really strategic. We're not seeking to extrapolate these results, as I said, to the general population, and we need to have really specific and clear criteria as we explain why these people, or why we're seeking to sample a certain type of person. For example, if I'm looking at how teachers who've recently graduated are managing behaviour and some of the strategies that they're using, I will obviously have certain criteria for that. I will determine, okay, how recently did you graduate, and are you working as a teacher at the moment? And I might deliberately pick people who think that they're quite strong in managing behaviour, or I might, sorry, that was my email thing, or I might deliberately pick people who identify themselves weak. So there will be specific criteria that you are explaining in your proposal, and you're also explaining it later on as you're writing up your research as part of B. This is very similar to what I said from Stringer. We might look at extreme or deviant case sampling, and it's just a word, if you like, that describes that sort of purposeful sampling approach. So we might say, I'm going to use an extreme case sampling method to find representatives who have whatever experience. Typical case is what it says. You might want to seek a maximum variation if that helps your research question. Often, and a lot of these can kind of overlap. So it's not just that you're picking one, you might have a number of these that overlap, and that's fine. You're just putting it forward, you're just explaining that I'm seeking typical cases within this particular criteria, and you explain what that criteria is. Often you also use convenience sampling, which I'm going to talk about very shortly. We can also use a stratified purposive sampling where we have typical cases. It doesn't really matter what these are called, but the idea is that you're explaining your reason for selecting these participants or inviting those participants to attend and participate. Snowball sampling is quite handy as well, because that's often when we don't really know who are going to be good people to ask. We're kind of throwing it out there. We're saying, I'm going to seek input from people who perhaps do coaching or something like that, and then find out whether they can recommend some good people to talk to. So just like a snowball rolls and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it's the same thing. Your sampling size increases because you're seeking to actually, initially you select a small group, but then you get those participants to propose others that would be relevant to speak and relevant people to participate. Can be quite useful when we're looking at networks of individuals, when that's the research focus. Also, something to keep in mind is that sampling isn't necessarily just about people. It can also be documents that we're picking that might represent a particular time or a particular, some sort of purposeful thing again, that it's a snippet of something. It can be time periods for observations. That's part of, so it might be the people that happen to be at a particular place at a particular time. That could be your sampling criteria. So it's kind of a criterion, but yeah, kind of a different aspect. Context need to be sampled if observations are made in different locations. Don't worry too much about that. Anyway. So one key idea, particularly when we are looking at fairly small groups, is that we continue sampling, so we continue interviewing and we continue to find participants until we've actually found that the same information keeps popping up, and we call that saturation. So that means that you're actually looking at the data you're collecting at the same time as you're collecting it, so you don't just think, okay, great, I've got 5 questionnaire responses, now I'm just going to leave that. But you look at it and you think, do I need to ask more people? Or do I need to change my questions or something to generate similar findings, which is that saturation point. And that's when no new or relevant data is emerging regarding something that you're really exploring. And you've also got a well-developed understanding in that category through the variation of responses, but it does keep re-emerging. You've established some good relationships between, so you've got a good understanding of how those different things fit together in respect to the data. Does size matter? Well, in general, sample sizes in qualitative research should not be so small that we cannot get data saturation. But at the same time, we don't want it too big either, because then it's just going to be too difficult to handle. And certainly for your purposes in respect to practitioner research, you want something that's going to be manageable, but you still want a bit of insight there. Generally, and this kind of segues us over to the quantitative perspective, or that deductive approach, the larger the sample, the more precise and representative it is likely to be. But keep in mind that when you're looking at something that's qualitative, we're not seeking to be representative. We're seeking a nuanced understanding of that context, but we're not seeking the broader perspective. As sample size increases, this also means that the likelihood of sampling error, which is something we consider quite a lot in quantitative research, because it's that deductive, we want to kind of have a minimal role as researchers, the sampling error likelihood decreases as we got a greater sample size. We need to be really frank and honest about the limitations of your sample, as you saw in the studies I put up, particularly like the Matheson study you looked at a few weeks ago, which was done by a student who was doing his last year placement. He had a fairly small sample size and he was still doing a quantitative approach, but as long as you're frank about it, it's fine. So for a quantitative or a deductive approach, often we're looking at some sort of random sampling method with the idea that every person or every participant has got an equal probability of being selected. So it's literally like drawing sticks out of a hat. And we talk about the number being the sample size and the capital N being the population size. So if I'm looking at teachers in Gippsland, that would be the population size, but I'm perhaps interviewing 15 people, so that would be the sample size. And then you actually select them randomly. Anyway. One thing which is quite important, particularly when we're looking at a more quantitative approach and when we're doing things like surveys, is to include a response rate. That can also include interviews, but some of the people that have been invited will not want to participate, or they might have said, yes, I will, and then they forget to give you the form. This is quite a common problem with teachers who are pretty time poor and who just, unless you kind of get them in the staff room when they're ready, the response rates are pretty poor often. So you calculate the response rate. You don't really need to know this now, but I'm sharing it with you anyway. By the number of usable questionnaires, for example, divided by the total sample minus the unsuitable or uncontactable people of your sample, and then you multiply it by 100 to get a percentage. So the response rate is the percentage of the people who agreed to participate. So you're not including those people who haven't consented to participate in the research. Convenience sample, which is probably something you are likely to be using because you're going to want people that you have access to. And if you're planning on doing your research at a school where you're doing your placement, for example, that's a good example of convenience sampling. So you pick a group that's accessible to you. It's likely to have quite a good response rate then. But again, keep in mind that those findings are not going to be generalizable, but nevertheless they will be particularly meaningful for you. Nevertheless, that's something you talk about in your limitations as you write up your research later on. You got some other tools there if you're curious about sampling. Those hyperlinks should work. I've had a go at them this morning. So you can just hop on them if you feel that way inclined. Please do keep in mind though to do the quiz this week and to do the ethics checklist, because you need to have that as part of your proposal. And that's it for the day. Thank you.